In this video, we are going to create a React and Node app from scratch that lets us store, view, and search for images. We will add pagination. When we click load more images get added to the UI. We will be using a service called Cloudinary to store and upload our images. And we will create a Node.js server that lets us connect the React front end to the Cloudinary API. This is a good project you can actually use yourself and will be good practice in building a full stack app from scratch and connecting to third-party APIs. Links to the finished code and final CSS are in the description. Let's get started. To store our images, we will use a service called Cloudinary. There is a free tier which lets us upload images and gives us access to an API to access those images. Go to cloudinary.com in your browser and click on sign up for free. In here, fill out the form and click on create account at the bottom. Then you just need to confirm your email. So go and click on the link in the email that you received. All being well, you will be brought to the Cloudinary dashboard. You can skip this questionnaire thing as it's not really important. At the top, you should see your account details. Now, this is what we will use later to connect to Cloudinary from our own API. If we click on the Browse Media Library link down here, you can see we don't want to watch this right now, so we'll just close it. In here, we have a bunch of sample images that are given to us. So in the samples folder, we have a bunch of subfolders and a bunch of images and stuff. So this is what we will use in our app. If you want, you can upload your own images using the upload button, but it's not important to do that right now. The first thing to think about when working with an outside API is, how do I connect to it? The best way to do this is to look at the documentation. From the dashboard, you want to click on this little question mark up here and click on documentation. This will open a new tab. Then we want to go to references at the top. So this shows all the APIs that are available for us to use. The one we want to use first is the admin API, which lets us administer our media assets. So we will click on this link. In here, you can see an example of the API endpoint that we need to hit. And it explains that to use the API, we need to authenticate using basic authentication. So basic authentication is just a username and password, which in this case is our API key and our API secret, which we can get on the dashboard. If we click on resources at the top here on this page, so we click the resources link, it shows us in detail about how to fetch a given resource. So it says we have to go to /resources/ whatever it is, the thing we're looking for. So in this case, we're looking for images. So go to /resources/image. Okay, so let's try and fetch our images from the Cloudinary API in Postman to see how it all works. So if you open up Postman and create a new request by clicking on the new tab button, we will grab the base URL from the docs and paste it into the URL bar in Postman. So in the docs, the base URL is, if we scroll to the top, I think it tells us somewhere up here, is this. So we'll grab this and we'll paste it in like so. The cloud name is whatever you created when you signed up and can be found on the dashboard. So back in Chrome, we'll jump back to the dashboard. And cloud name is this string of characters here. So I'm just going to copy this and paste it just after the first slash. Next, we want to replace this action placeholder. So the action is whatever we want to get. In this case, we want to get the resources. So we'll do /resources/image. So this will go and grab all our images that we've seen in the media library on Cloudinary. Now, if we try this by clicking send, you'll see we get an error that says invalid credentials. Remember, the docs told us that we need to authenticate using basic authentication, passing in our API key and our secret. To do this in Postman, click on the authorization tab, and in the type, we just want to select basic off. Now on the right hand side, you'll see a place to put in your username and password. So I have some old stuff in here which I'll just delete, and what we want to do is copy the API key paste it in, whoops, copy, paste it in as the username, and you want to take the API secret and copy it, paste it in as the password. Okay, and okay, so now if we try this again and click send, and we'll just expand this up so that we can see. So now we have got 200 okay response, which means everything went well. And we have a response object, which has a resources array. Each object in the array is an image. So we can copy one of these URLs and paste it in the browser just to see what the image is. And this one's a nice panoramic image of somewhere dusty. So this proves that it's all working. Okay, so now that we have set up our Cloudinary account and made some practice requests using Postman, we can start building our app. We will start with the React front end. So open up a terminal and change the directory to where you want your project to be. We will create a new folder called React Photo Gallery. So this will hold both our front end and our API. So we will change our directory to this new folder, and in here we're going to use create React app to create a React skeleton project. So go ahead and type npx create React app, and we will call this one client since it's the client of our application. When that's finished, we will open up the React Photo Gallery folder, which we just created. So in the project tree, we'll click open folder and navigate to where your folder is, and you want to select React Photo Gallery and click open. You can see the client folder, which has the React front-end code within it. This is what Create React App has created for us. Later, we will add the API folder in here too. This just means we can quickly work with the front end and the API in the same IDE without having to jump all over the place. So in our client folder, we will go ahead and delete the files that we don't need. Open the client, open the source folder, and we're going to delete the test, the logo, report web vitals, and setup tests. So delete those files, and we will jump into index.js and delete the import report web vitals from the top and delete this stuff at the bottom. Finally, we will jump into app.js, and we're going to delete everything in here and create our own component just to make sure that everything is working. So I am using an extension that lets me quickly create React components by typing RAFCE, which creates me a component with the same name of the file. You can check the link in the description to get this extension, and it's quite a handy thing to have. If you prefer not to use it, you can just go ahead and type out the component as usual. Once you've created the component within the div, we're just going to type some text. So we'll say hello React and click save. Now open up a terminal again and make sure you're in the client directory by typing cd client, and in here we will just start the app by typing npm start, which should open up the browser. As you can see, the app has started on localhost and our text hello React has appeared. So this means that our app is working. Okay, so before we can display a list of images, we need to get images from somewhere. What we are going to do is take the response we get from Cloudinary and manually add it to our code. This way, we can pretend we have made an API call and use this fake response to render our images. To do this, we will jump into Postman and make a request to get the list of images just like we did before. Once we have a response, as you can see down here in the body, we're going to select all and copy it. Next, we'll jump back into Visual Studio Code. We are going to create a new file called api-mock.json. And in this file, we're just going to paste everything we copied from Postman and save. Now in app.js, we can import this. So we'll say import images from open quotes and say .api-mock.json. So anytime we import from a JSON file, it gets converted to an object and assigned to an images variable. So in our app function, we will just log out the images variable to the console. So we'll say console.log, and we'll just add the text images, so we know what it is, comma, images. And then if we save this, we'll jump into the browser, and if we refresh again, you can see in the console, the images object has been logged out. And if we expand it, an object in the same shape, which has the same properties as what we will get back from the Cloudinary API. So if we go into one of these resources, if we pick the first one, and you can see it's got all the stuff related to an image. This is what we will use to build out our UI. And once we have built the server, we will remove this mock data and get the images from our server instead. Okay, so now we have some images to play with. We can start working on displaying them in a grid. If we look at the finished app, we have our images in a grid. As we resize the window, everything resizes to fit and is nice and responsive. We will start by jumping into app.js and creating a state hook to hold our images. We will delete this console log statement, and then we'll say const, open our square brackets. Then we'll say image list, comma, set image list is going to be equal to use state. And we need to import the use state hook from React, which we can do at the top. We want to initialize our state hook with the images from our API mock. So to do that, in the use state function, we will pass in images.resources. Remember, our images come from the resources array, which comes from our mock JSON file. We put our images in state because the images array will be updated by the user, as we will see later. When you have things on your UI that will change, it's generally a good idea to put that thing in state. Next, we will render the images in our JSX. So we will remove the hard-coded text that we added, and we will give this div a class name of image grid, as this will be our CSS Grid container, which we will use to position the images. So in here, we're going to take a new line, open our braces, and we're going to use the map function. So say image list.map, and we'll pass in our function. And the map function will give us the current image that the map function is currently on. And for each image, we want to display it in an image tag. So we'll say source equals open braces image.url. So if we look at our JSON again, each image object that comes back in the resources array is going to have a URL that holds the image, and it's saying image elements must have an alt prop. So we will say alt is equal to image dot, let's take the public ID, and if we save this, okay, I think that should do it. So if we look at Chrome, let's see what we have. So our images are displaying, but they are all over the place and they're all different sizes. That's because the image tag displays images at their full dimension. Let's add some CSS to make the images the same size for now. So back in Visual Studio Code, we're going to go into app.css, and we have some stuff in here that we don't need, so we can just delete everything. And then we will add the image CSS class and open our braces. So we will just say width is 300 pixels and the height we will make 300 pixels as well. Now if we save this, hopefully it resizes, and it hasn't. So let's see, what have we missed? If we jump back into app.js, and yeah, so we haven't imported our style sheet. So we'll do import, open our quotes, and do ./app.css. And if we try again in Chrome, you can see the images are all the same size, but it's not quite responsive yet. So even though things drop onto the next line, they don't resize based on the screen size, which is what we want. This is where CSS Grid comes in. So back in app.css, we will take a new line and we will say .image-grid and open our braces. In here, we want to say display grid, since this is going to be our CSS Grid container, and we'll say gap of 0.5 rem. This adds a gap between each grid item. And now for the fun part, we will say grid-template-columns and then use the repeat function. Inside this, we will say auto-fill, take a comma, type min, max, and open some braces. In here, we will say 450 pixels, comma, 1 fr. So don't worry if you got a bit lost there. What this line does is tells CSS Grid, okay, I want you to resize the columns based on this range of 450 and 1 fractional unit to fit as many columns as you can in a single row. Any columns that don't fit drop onto the next line. So this is quite a useful piece of code, so take some time to experiment and investigate how it works by changing some of these values and trying different things. Okay, so since CSS Grid is doing all the crazy magic to calculate the column size, we want our images to take up 100% of the column that they are in. In our image class, instead of these hard-coded values, we can now change it to 100% for the width and 100% for the height. This means the image will take up 100% of the column that it's in. As the column resizes, then the image will resize as well. So if we save this and have a look at Chrome, hopefully everything is working. So we have a few images with 2 rows. As we drag the window in, you can see the images resize. And as we go to the mobile screen, you can see we have a nice vertical column. And as we expand back out, you can see they grow. Some of these images are looking a bit distorted and stretched. What we can do is, in our image class, we can say object fit cover. This ensures the images aren't distorted or stretched and they will fit nicely within our grid. So if we save and try again, you can see that things look a bit clearer now and we still have our nice responsive grid. Now I think we can upload an image and it should appear here. So if we go to the Cloudinary dashboard and if we click on the Browse Media Library, and if we click this upload button and just select an image from your documents or something like that and click open. So I'm going to add a picture of a tree and it should start uploading. Now if we jump back into our app and if we do refresh, it should appear, and it does. Okay, so now we have the UI and our Cloudinary set up. We need to connect the two together. For this, we will create our own API using Node.js that will in turn call the Cloudinary API with our secure credentials and return our images. If you would rather focus on the React side, you can skip to the next step and get the finished server from GitHub. Check the description for the link. So back in our project, we will create a new folder called API. Make sure you create this outside the client folder as the front end and the server are completely separate. Now we need to initialize an npm project so we can download and use npm packages. So open a terminal and make sure you're in the top level of the API folder. So we'll do cd API, and next we'll type npm init. Just hit enter a few times to skip through these options. Now in the API folder, you should see a package JSON file. So there isn't very much in here yet, so let's add some packages to help us run our server. First we will install Express. This lets our Node app handle incoming web requests. So in the terminal, in the API folder, we will do npm I express. Next, we will install body parser, which lets us easily get the body from a request as JSON. So we'll say npm I body dash parser. Next, we need to install Axios, which lets us make outgoing API requests to Cloudinary. So type npm I Axios. We will add cores so we don't run into any cross-origin issues. So we'll say npm I cores, and lastly we will install .env so we can store our API key and our secret as environment variables. So we'll say npm i.env. And oh, I almost forgot some dev dependencies that we'll need. So we also need to install nodemon, which automatically restarts our server when we make any changes. So we'll do npm i nodemon, and then we'll do -- save dev. This means this only gets stored as a dev dependency and doesn't get included in the production code. As you can see, this one has just been saved as a dev dependency. And while we're here, I guess we will install ESLint just to help us catch any issues a bit earlier. So the npm i ESLint, and we will set up our ESLint config by saying npx ESLint -- init. And we'll just select some of these options. So we'll say to check syntax and find problems, we're going to use common.js as we're in a Node app and we're not using a front-end framework and we're not using TypeScript, and the code is going to run in Node, and we will set our config as a JavaScript file, and it's telling us to install some dependencies, so we'll say yes. So we'll let this run, and as you can see, we now have an ESLint file set up which has all our stuff in it, and we have a package.json file which has all our dependencies and our dev dependencies. So the last thing we need to do is we want to create a script in package.json that lets us start our server using nodemon. So in the scripts section here, we will delete the test script. We will open some quotes and then we'll type server, and we will type our command. So add a colon, and after the colon, open some quotes, and then we'll say nodemon. And this is going to call a .server.js file, which we haven't created yet. Okay, so in the API folder, we will create a file called server.js. This will hold the logic to run our server and our API. At the top, we will import the stuff that we just installed. We'll import express. So it's express equals require express. We'll import .env. We'll import cors, and we want to take the JSON function from body parser. Finally, we'll import Axios. Next, we will initialize an expressed app by saying const app is equal to express. Open and close braces. This will create a new express application and assign it to the app variable. Now we need to tell our new express app to use cors and JSON. So we will say app.use, and we'll pass in the cors function, and we'll do the same for the JSON function. Next, we want to create an endpoint that our React client can call. So we'll take a new line, and then we'll say app.get. The first argument is the endpoint. So we'll open our quotes, and then we'll say /photos. So this get function that we're about to create will handle all the requests that go to localhost 7000/photos. And next we need to pass in our async function. This will be an arrow function, and Express will pass in two arguments for us. The first one is the request. This contains all the data and information that comes in with the request. The second parameter is the response. This is what we use to respond to the requests. So in here, in the body of this function, we will eventually call the Cloudinary API using our secure credentials. But for now, we will just return a message to make sure everything is working. So we'll say return, and then we will use the res parameter that Express gives us and say .send. So in here we can respond to the request with whatever we want. So we'll open and close some braces to pass back an object. Then we'll say message, and we'll just add a string that says hello. Finally, we need to tell our Node server what port to listen to. So we'll take a new line after the get function that we just created, and we will define our port. So say const port is equal to 7000. And then we'll say app.listen, open our braces, and we'll pass in our port. And we can also pass a message here. So we'll say console.log, and this will just say server running on port, and we'll pass in our port as a template string, like so. So this is effectively going to start our server on whatever port that we defined, and it's going to add a message to the terminal to tell us if it has started successfully. Okay, so let's save this and try it out in Postman. So now we have created our server code. We can start this by opening up a terminal, and in your API directory, we want to do npm run server. You can see that nodemon is doing its thing here and that the server has started on port 7000. So now if we open Postman, we will create a new request. This will be a GET request since that's the only endpoint our server has at the minute. And we'll say localhost 7000. So now if we do a GET, we should see the message. And it's saying error, cannot get for some reason. So it's saying 404. Oh, that's because our endpoint is on /photos, because that's the string that we passed in. And if we do send, now we can see that we get our message back. So our Node server is working. Now that our API server is working, we want to call the Cloudinary API to get our images. As a quick reminder, we need to do a get to this URL by passing in our cloud name and our API key and our API secret as our username and password. This is what we need to replicate in our Node.js server requests. So the first thing we want to do is create an environment variable file to hold our Cloudinary connection details. In the API folder, we will create a file called .env. The dot is important as it tells the code this is a configuration file, as you can see by the gear icon that has appeared beside it. In here, we will create variables that we need for each of these things. Remember that you can get your API key, secret, and the cloud name from your Cloudinary dashboard. We will just say API key is equal to whatever your API key is. Cloud name is going to be equal to whatever your cloud name is. And finally, we'll say API secret is going to be whatever your secret is. So just copy it and paste it in here. Now in server.js, we can get these things as variables and use them in the code. So just above our get request, we will say const, open our braces, and then we'll say parsed, and this is going to be equal to .env.config. So the config function gives us a variable called parsed, but we will rename this to config, like so, as it's a more descriptive name. Now we can create the Cloudinary endpoint string that we need to call from our requests. So just below our config import, we can say const base URL is going to be equal to, and we will open backticks to indicate that we want a template string. What we're going to do is copy the URL from Postman or from the Cloudinary dashboard, whatever is easiest, and we will paste it in like so. And we're going to delete the cloud name and we're going to take it from the config instead. So we'll say config.cloud name. Next, we need to create an object to hold our username and password. So we'll say const auth is equal to an object. And here we'll say username, and this is going to be config.api key. And the password is going to be config.api secret. This is what we will pass to the Cloudinary API to authenticate ourselves and prove we are who we say we are. Now we are going to use Axios to create a request to get the images from Cloudinary. In our get function, we will take a new line and we will say const response is going to equal to await Axios.get open braces, and we'll pass in our base URL. This just means we're going to go and do a GET request to whatever the base URL is. Axios lets us pass in some configuration as an object. So just after base URL, we will take a comma, open our braces, and this will contain our config for this request. At the minute, all we need to do is pass in our username and password. So we'll just pass in the auth object in here. So we'll just say auth. What we want to do now is simply return the data that comes back from Cloudinary. We can delete the object that we passed to our send function previously and say response.data. So if we save this and we will try it in Postman, we will open a new request and we'll say localhost 7000/photos. If we call our API server, hopefully we get a list of images back. And we do. I'm glad that that worked first time. So as you can see, we've got our resources array, and each object in the array has a bunch of images in it. So these are the images that are coming from our Cloudinary API. So this may seem a bit odd to set up a server just to return some data without doing anything with that data. But remember, the main reason we can't call the Cloudinary API from the UI is because of security. So the API key and the secret are hidden on the server and are not exposed on the UI. So we're keeping our username and password nice and safe. The only way for someone to get these would be to hack our server and get it from the code. This also has the added benefit of adding more stuff in here, like your own IDs or some other data that you want to add to the response before sending it back to the client. We also split these credentials into their own environment file, as it means we can remove them from the code completely and add them at the point that the code is deployed to the production server. This is quite advanced, so don't panic if it doesn't make sense straight away, but it's always good to know how these things work. Okay, so now we have the API connected to Cloudinary. We can complete the circle by calling our own API from our React client. So in the client folder, we will start by creating a new .env file. In here, we will put our API URL. So we will type React app API URL, and it's going to be equal to http://localhost:7000. Since we are using create React app, we must prefix this with React_app. And same as before, we are just putting any environment config in here so that when we deploy the code, the URL can be changed before it gets to production if needs be. So we'll save this. Next, in the source directory, we want to create a new file called api.js. This is where we will put our API requests. The first thing we will do is import the API URL so that we can use it in our requests. So we'll say const API_URL is equal to process.env.react_app_API URL. Next, we will create a function that will call our photos endpoint and return the JSON. So we'll say const get images is equal to an async arrow function. And in here, we're going to use the fetch API. So we'll say const response is equal to await fetch. And then we will use a template string and we'll pass in our API URL. Then we will do /photos. So this is going to create our endpoint based on the API URL and the photos endpoint. So the reason we are creating our endpoint like this is because it makes it easy to add new endpoints based on the API URL, as we will see later in the tutorial. Next, we will say const response JSON is equal to await response.json. This just takes the response and converts it to JSON. Once we have the JSON, we can just say return response JSON. And we will export this function so that our components can call this function. Putting the requests in their own file keeps things organized and easy to change in future if the need arises. Next, we will jump into app.js. This is where we will fetch the data. When the app component loads for the first time, we want to immediately call our API to get our photos. To achieve this, we can use the use effect hook. We will say use effect and pass in our function, which is going to be an arrow function, and we will import it from React at the top, just beside use state. We'll say comma use effect, like so. In our use effect hook, we will say const fetch data is going to be equal to an async function, and in here we're going to say const response JSON is going to be equal to await get images. And as you can see, it has imported the get images function from our API. So this is the function that we just created that calls our API and returns us the images as a response object. So now, once we have this, we just need to set it in state. We will say set image list, open our braces, and then we will say response JSON.resources. Lastly, we just need to call this function by saying fetch data. We just need to tell our use effect hook that we only want to run this code when the component loads for the first time. So to do this, just outside our function that we passed in, we're going to do a comma and pass in an empty array. This is the dependency array, and it indicates the different things that can trigger this use effect hook to run. So if it's empty, it only runs when a component loads. Since we have the real data now, we can remove the mock JSON that we created at the very start and initialize the state hook with an empty array instead. So we can delete images.resources and just pass in an empty array. Since the data that comes back from our API is the same shape and has the same properties as our mock JSON, everything should work once we get the real response and save it into state. So now if we save this, and we will try this in Chrome. So if we go to localhost 3000, and you can see the images are loading. If we look at the network tab, you can see it's calling our photos endpoint and passing us back our images, which are getting displayed in the app. The app is working pretty well now, although you may have noticed that we only get 10 images back. This is the default number set by the Cloudinary API. If we look at the final example of our app, you can see we have this load more button. When we click it, it loads more images. When there are no more images, the button disappears. How do we achieve this? Well, the Cloudinary API has support for pagination built into it. If we look at Postman and make a request, you can see we get the first 10 images back as usual, but since we have more than 10 images stored on our account, we also get this next cursor property back. This is effectively a reference to the next 10 images that are stored in our Cloudinary account. In other words, this is a reference to the next page of results. So if we take this property value and add it to the parameters by saying next underscore cursor, and the value we will set to whatever we got back from the response. If we do a get request, you can see we get the next 10 images back, and we get a new next cursor property, which contains a reference to the next 10 images, or in other words, the next page. So again, we can copy this and paste it in, just like we did before. And this time we get our images back, but we do not get a next cursor property in this response, which means we are on the last page and there are no more results. So to achieve this in our app, what we're going to do is whenever the load more button is clicked, we will call the Cloudinary API to get our images as usual, but this time we will pass the next cursor property along with the request. This will give us the next 10 images, or in other words, the next page of results. Then we will render these on the UI. Okay, so now we only want to show the button if there are more images to load. How do we know if there are more images? Remember, if there are more images, the API returns the next cursor property in the response. Since we will use this next cursor property a lot, and it may change after each request, it's a good idea to use a state hook to store this. Back in our code in app.js, just below the image list state hook, we will create a new one. So we'll take a new line and we will say const, open our square brackets, and we'll say next cursor, comma, set next. And this will be equal to use state, and we will initialize this to be null. Where do we get the next cursor property? Well, our Node API will return the response to our React frontend exactly as it is retrieved from Cloudinary. So if we look at the dev tools for our app by jumping into the network tab and refreshing the page, when we call the photos endpoint of our Node API, you can see the response in the preview tab. So we have the resources, and we also have this next cursor property, which has this long string. So if we jump back into our code, that means we have the next cursor property in our response JSON object. So all we have to do is pick out the property and set it into state. To do this, we will take a new line after set image list, and we will call the function that sets the next cursor in state. So we'll say set next cursor, open some braces, and then we'll say response JSON dot next underscore cursor. This comes back from the response with an underscore, but we're just using camel case in our own state object just to keep things consistent. So it doesn't really matter what you name these things up here. Okay, so now when the page loads, we set our images. If there is a next page, we store the cursor in state. Now in our JSX, we only want to render the load more button if the next cursor is present, because if it is, it means there are images to load from the server. So down in our JSX, we're going to add some curly braces around our button. And just to the left of the button tag, we're going to say next cursor, and then do a double ampersand. So this is just a shorthand conditional that means if this is true, then display the button. If this is false or undefined or null, then don't do anything with this and just render nothing. So now if we try this, the button appears because we received a next cursor property in the response. It doesn't do anything yet because we haven't coded any logic for the button. Okay, so now we have our next cursor saved to state. We can use it to display more images when the load more button is clicked. We will jump into our code and jump into api.js, and we will start by updating our getImages function to accept the next cursor property. So we'll just pass it in like so. This is how we will pass the next cursor property to the Node API, and in turn the Cloudinary API, to tell them we want the next page of 10 results. The API documentation tells us that we need to pass the cursor property in the URL as a query param. The easiest way for us to do this is to create a new URL search params object. We will take a new line just inside the function, and we will say const params is going to be equal to new URL search params. Open and close brackets. We want to check the next cursor variable has a value before we append it to our query params. So we'll say if next cursor, and in the code block we'll say params.append. Open our braces, open our quotes. So we need to give it a key, which we'll say next cursor, and we will pass in the value, which in this case will be next cursor. Remember, when the app loads for the first time, it will use this function as well, and we may not have a next cursor at that point. So now in our fetch function call, we can append our params. So we'll add a question mark to indicate that this is the start of the query params. Add a $sign, open some brackets, and we'll add params in here. So this will automatically convert the params to a string and append them to the request. This approach makes our code a bit more reusable. Okay, so that's the front end fetch bit complete. Next, we need to create an event handler function that gets called when our button is clicked. So we'll jump into app.js, and just below the use effect, we will create a function called handle load more button click. This will be equal to an async arrow function, since we're going to be making asynchronous API calls in here. What we want to do is similar to what we did before, but slightly different. So we'll say const response JSON is equal to await get images, and we'll pass in the next cursor. So at this point, we will have gotten a response back from the API, which has our images and all the properties we need stored in the response JSON variable. So now we can just set these things in state, just like we did before. The first thing I'll do is do set images by calling set image list and opening our braces. This time, since the API gives us back the next 10 results, we don't want to override the image list state value with the new list that we get back from the API. Instead, we want to append it onto the end of the current list. To do this, we can pass in an arrow function to our set image list function, and React will pass in the current state for us. In this case, we'll call it current image list. This is the list of images we currently have. What we want to do is create a new array, and we want to spread the current image list, do a comma, and we want to append the new images onto the end by saying response JSON dot resources, and we'll spread this as well by doing the 3 dots. Next, we will set the next cursor if we have one. So we'll say response JSON dot next cursor. Oops, next underscore cursor, as this is how it comes back from the API. Okay, so this looks good. We will jump into our button, and what we want to do is call this function when the button is clicked. So we'll say onClick is equal to handle load more button click. Okay, so I think at this point we can try this and see what happens. Okay, so if we click load more and have a look at the network tab, you can see our front end is sending the next cursor along with the request, but our Node API isn't doing anything with it yet. As you can see, the next cursor is being ignored, and we're getting the same 10 images back that we already have. This shows that the logic to add the new images to the UI works at least. Now, the final step we need to do is add a small change to our Node API to take the next cursor from the request made by our front end and pass it to the Cloudinary API. So we'll jump back into server.js in our code. Remember, we created this GET request using Axios, which will call the Cloudinary API and securely retrieve our images. What we want to do in here is pass the next cursor property to the Cloudinary API. Since our front end has sent the next cursor property as a query param to our Node API, we can get this property from the request variable. So in our Axios GET request, we will add a params object just below the auth object inside our request. So we'll say params and open some braces to indicate we want an object. And in here, we will say next underscore cursor. And this will be request dot query dot next cursor. Since this is the key that we sent with our request in API.js in here, any query params you pass to a Node API will be available in the request.query object. Okay, so now that next cursor is going to be passed to Cloudinary, we can save this. We jump back into Chrome and we will refresh the page. Now if we click load more, you can see we get the next page of 10 images back. If we click load more again, we get the third page, and this time, because we don't have any images left, the button has disappeared. So this approach of passing a property to get the next page of results is typically how pagination works in production. The main reason for this is performance, as it prevents the same data from being fetched multiple times. Next, we are going to create a search function for a bit more practice. If we look at the finished example, we have a search bar. If we type something in, click search, it will look in our images on Cloudinary and return any matches. We will be using the Cloudinary search API this time. as opposed to the admin API, which we have been using until now. This will pretty much follow the patterns we have been using so far, so this would be a good time to pause the video and try it yourself before following along. If you do, don't worry if your approach is different to mine. The main thing is that you get it working. Okay, so there are two things we need to do. First, we need to create a search bar that the user can type a search value for and send this to our Node API. Secondly, we need to create a new Node API endpoint to receive the search value and pass it on to Cloudinary. This endpoint also needs to return the results from Cloudinary to our React frontend. It doesn't really matter what order we do these things in, since we have both our frontend and our Node server both set up anyway. But we will start with the Node API, since this means we will have some real data to work with when it comes to build out the React frontend. Before we jump into the Node API, let's spend some time exploring what the request will look like. If we look at the documentation, which you can find the link in the description for, you can see it tells us how the search API works. So we pass a value and it searches the attributes on the image, such as the file name, tags, and so on, which is quite nice. If we scroll down a bit, we can see the URL we need and also the parameters. The most important parameter is the expression, which is effectively our search term, which we will capture in our search bar on the React frontend. We can also pass the next cursor for pagination, which is similar to what we have done already. Okay, so let's open up Postman and see if we can get the search API to work. So in Postman, we want to create a new GET request that calls the search endpoint. This will be similar to the endpoint that we used to get our images. So it's going to be the endpoint, which is api.cloudinary/v1_1/ your cloud name / resources. And then after this, we're just going to put in search. And if we have a look at the parameter, we need the expression. So in the params tab of Postman, we can put in expression. For the value, we're going to say kitten. And we'll double check that our authorization is being passed in. Remember, the Cloudinary API uses basic auth, and the username is your API key and your password is your API secret, both of which can be found on your Cloudinary dashboard. So now if we try this, we're expecting to get one resource back. So I can expand this and click send. And you can see it's given us total count of 1, and we get a resources array back with an object containing the image and a bunch of other stuff, similar to what we've seen before. You can have a look at your Cloudinary media folder to see what other example images you can search for. So it looks like we've got the request to Cloudinary figured out, so we just need to replicate this in our Node API. Okay, so now we will jump into server.js, and we're going to start by refactoring this a bit. So instead of the base URL containing the path to the images, remove this and put it in the string for the request to get the photos instead. So down in here, we'll just do plus, open our quotes, and paste it in. This just means that we can reuse the base URL in our search endpoint, which we will see in a bit. Okay, so now we're going to make our search endpoint. So it's going to look similar to this function in that it will use Axios to call Cloudinary and return the data. So we will take a new line and say app.get, open our braces, open some quotes, and we'll pass in the string of which we want the endpoint to be. So it's going to be /search. Next, we'll pass in our async function, and this will be an arrow function. And in here, we'll do const response is equal to await axios.get, and we'll pass in our base URL and append our endpoint, which is going to be resources/search. And we'll do a comma just after this to pass in some configuration, open and close some braces. And in here, we will pass our auth, similar to what we did before. And we're going to pass in some params. Remember, the UI will send a search value which we will need to send to the Cloudinary API as an expression query param. In the params object, we will say expression. This will be request.query.expression. We just want to return the data as we get it from the Cloudinary API. So we'll say return res.send, and we'll send back a response.data. And it's saying rec is not defined and res is not defined. And that's because we haven't added these parameters to our function. Remember that Node will pass in the request as a variable and also the response as a variable, which we can use in the function of our body to send stuff back. Since these endpoints call different Cloudinary APIs, it's a good idea to keep them separate. It also makes things a bit cleaner and easier to find what we're looking for. So our React frontend will call the /search endpoint on localhost 7000 and pass in an expression query parameter, which is effectively our search term that the user has typed. Then in our node server, we're going to call the Cloudinary search API endpoint using Axios, and we'll pass in the search term as an expression. And then the response we get back from Cloudinary is just going to be passed straight back to the React front end. So this is similar to what we did with the photos endpoint. Okay, so now if we save this, that should be our search endpoint setup. We can try this in Postman just to make sure it's working before we start our front end. So we will create a new request, and we're going to call our Node API, which lives on localhost /7000/search. In the params tab, we'll pass in an expression. We'll give it a value of kitten, and if we do a get, it should return us a single image, the same as it did before. And it does, as we can see down here. We have our response with the resources in it. So this is working. Okay, so now we have our API working. We can add the search form that appears at the top of our app. So we will jump into app.js and scroll down to our JSX. In here, we will add a form tag, and inside we will add an input so the user can type a value, and we'll say that this is required, and we'll add a placeholder. So we'll say enter a search value. On the next line, we'll add a button. This will have a type of submit, so whenever this is clicked, it will submit the form. And we'll add some text that says search. Just below this, we'll add a button for the clear. So this will have a type of button, and we'll add some text which says clear. We will focus on the search for now and add the logic to reset the form and the app later. Okay, so let's have a look at Chrome. So the buttons and input have appeared, but they're quite small, so let's style it up. Let's go into app.css, and we will style the input and the buttons first. So at the top, we will say form input to select the input inside the form tag. We'll say padding 14 pixels, border 3 pixels, and we'll say solid and add our RGB value, which is just a gray value. We'll say border radius of 10 pixels. We'll say box sizing, border box, and font size will make 32 pixels, like so. And it looks like our border isn't appearing, so we'll change our RGB value to something a bit darker. So we'll say 225 for each of these instead of 255, and save. And as you can see, it now appears. And next we will style the buttons. So we'll say form button, and we want to remove the default border, so we'll say border none. We'll add a border radius of 10 pixels. Font size, we will say 32, which is the same as our input, and we'll add some padding of 16. pixels. Okay, so the buttons are looking a bit better, but we want the clear button to have a red background. So we can select the button type by saying a form button, open some square braces, and then we'll say type equals button. Open our brackets. This will select the button elements with a type of button that are inside the form. So we only have the one, which is the clear button, which is what we want. So back in our CSS, we'll just change the background color to be this red color. So we'll say RGB and add our value. As you can see, this is now turned a reddish color. Now to position and make the form responsive, we will use CSS Grid. So we will apply this to the form tag. So we'll say form, and we'll add a margin of 1 rem for the top, 0 for the right, 1 rem for the bottom, and 0 for the left. And then we'll say display grid to say that this is a CSS Grid container. If we see it, you can see it's added everything in a column. So now we'll just add some spacing around each grid item by saying gap, and we'll say 20 pixels. If we save, this has added some nice spacing between each element. This looks good on mobile, but if we expand the window out, things are still stacked in a column. What we want on bigger screens is to have the form on the same line. So to do this, we can use a media query. So just below our form CSS styles, we will say at the media, only screen, and open braces. And in here, we want to say if the min width is 960 pixels, we want to change the columns in our form grid. To do that, we'll say form, when the screen goes over 960 pixels, these styles, which we'll add in a second, will get applied to the existing styles. And here we will say grid template columns, which lets us specify the number of columns we want in our CSS grid, which we have defined in the form tag. And here we'll just say 5fr space 1fr 1fr. Since we have three things, we're going to add 3 columns. Fr just means fractional unit, and what the 5 means is it's going to take up 5 units of available space. If we total this up, we have 7, and the 5 means take up 5/7 of that space, which leaves 1 unit for the search button and 1 unit for the clear button. So now if we save this and we will expand the window again, you can see after we get past a certain point that the button's gone to the same line, and the search bar takes up 5/7 of the space, regardless of the screen size. So we'll bring this back down. We have our search form, but it doesn't do anything yet, so we need to add the logic to make it work. We need to know the value of the form so we can send it to our Node search endpoint. We can achieve this by storing the search value that the user has typed in state. So in app.js, we will create a new state hook to hold this value. Just below our existing state hooks, we will say const, open our braces, search value, comma, set search value. And this will be equal to use state. And we will initialize this to an empty string. Now we just need to set the value of our input to whatever the search value is. So down in our input, we will say value is equal to search value. We always want to update the search value when the user types. We can do this with an onChange event. In our input, we can say onChange is going to be equal to, and we will pass in an arrow function here. React will pass in the event to our function. So we can call the set search value function and pass in the thing that the user has typed, which we can get from the event dot target dot value, like so. So if we try this in Chrome and type, it should act the same, but behind the scenes we are saving this value as a state variable called search value. So the reason we do this is that it gives us easy access to whatever the user has typed in the form as a variable. It also gives us better control over the actual value of the input which is useful for things like resetting, which we will see in a bit. Next, we want to add a new function that calls our node search endpoint and passes the search value as a query parameter. To do this, we will jump into api.js and create a new function. So we'll say const search images is going to be equal to an async arrow function, and it's going to accept the search value as a parameter. Now in here, we want to do similar to before by creating some URL search params. So we'll say const params equals new URL search params and open our braces. Next, we'll say append, open and close braces, and we want to pass in the expression query param. So open our strings and add expression. Then we'll say comma and we'll pass in our search value. Next, we want to check if we have the next cursor, just like we did before, and if so, we want to append it to the query parameters. So we'll say if next cursor, and we'll say params.append next cursor, comma, next cursor. And it's saying next cursor is not defined, which means we haven't passed it in. So say search value, we'll pass in another parameter called next cursor. So this function will take the search value and the next cursor and pass it in as query params. Now we will create our fetch request that will call our node search API endpoint. So we'll say const response is going to be equal to await fetch, and we want to create a string based off the API URL which we have added as an environment variable, similar to the fetch we created before. It's going to be open backticks, $, open braces to say we want to create a template string, and then we'll do API URL / search, as this is the endpoint we created in our own node search API. And then we will do question mark to indicate the start of the query params, and again we'll do $, open and close some quotes or some braces, sorry, and we'll pass in our params like so. So this will do a fetch request and assign the result to our response. Now we will convert the response to JSON by saying const response JSON is equal to await response dot JSON. And if all goes well, we want to return the response JSON. Lastly, we just want to export this function so that we can import it in our components. This is similar to what we have done before. Again, we keep our API functions separate from our components, as it makes the code more reusable and easier to maintain. We'll save this, and finally we will jump back into app.js and we will import our search images function that we just created from the api.js file. Now all that's left to do is, whenever the form is submitted, we want to call our search images function, passing in the search value and the next cursor if we have one. So take a few lines and we will say const handle form submit, and this is going to be equal to an async arrow function, and the form will pass in the event for us. So in here, the first thing we want to do is say event.prevent default. This will prevent the form from trying to do a post and refreshing the page. So in here, we will say const response JSON is going to be equal to await search images, and we will pass in our search value and we'll pass in the next cursor. So again, this is all very similar to what we did with the pagination. Once we have the response JSON, that means the requests have completed and we have some data. We can do set image list, and this is going to be response JSON dot resources, which is the array that holds our images. We also want to set the next cursor in case our search term has returned us multiple pages of images. So we'll say response JSON dot next underscore cursor, and we will add a on submit property to our form, and this is going to be equal to the name of the function we just created, which is handle form submit. And I've just spotted a typo in our input, so this should be required with a D on the end. Okay, so this looks good. Let's fire it up and see what happens. So we open Chrome and we will type our search term, click search, and there we go. So it's returned us one image. So if we have a look on Cloudinary, and if we go to browse media library, we can see what other images we have to search for. So if we look at the samples folder, we have elephants. So let's try that just to make sure that this is working. So we'll say elephants, and if we search, and that doesn't work. So it looks like it's trying to display something. So let's have a look and see what happened. If we look at the elements, we can see, well, it's displayed the source. Oh, this is an MP4, so that's not going to work inside an image tag. I didn't realize that Cloudinary would generate videos for us, but that's nice. So let's try a different one. If we try bike, we should get this image of a person sitting beside their bike, and we'll type bike. Oops. And hopefully this works, and it does. Okay. That would be a good challenge for you to try, is try and display videos in here as well, using the video tag or something similar. Okay, so the last thing we need to do is clear the search input and display all the images again when the user clicks on the clear button. In our app.js, we will create a function that calls the get images API again and resets our search value state input. So we'll do const reset form. Let's be equal to arrow function, and don't forget the async keyword because this is going to be doing an API call. And in here we'll say const response JSON is equal to await get images, and we don't pass anything in this time because we want to get the first 10, and then we'll do set image list, and we'll pass in response JSON dot resources, and we want to set the next cursor to be whatever is in the response. So response JSON dot next cursor. We also want to reset our search value, so we'll say set search value, and this will be an empty string. So all we're doing is going and getting the first bunch of images, setting this in state, adding the next cursor if we get one back, and resetting the search value to an empty string. Now we'll just add an on click event to our clear button that calls this function. So down in our clear button, let's say on click, it's going to be equal to reset form. And if we save this and open up Chrome, we will try searching for bike again, and as you can see it's appeared, and if we click on clear, it resets. We get the load more button, and we'll just check that this is working, and it is. In this video, we are going to create a React and Node app from scratch that lets us store, view, and search for images. We will add pagination. When we click load more images get added to the UI. We will be using a service called Cloudinary to store and upload our images. And we will create a Node.js server that lets us connect the React front end to the Cloudinary API. This is a good project you can actually use yourself, and will be good practice in building a full stack app from scratch and connecting to third-party APIs. Links to the finished code and final CSS are in the description. Let's get started.